This is a detailed breakdown of how Leech works in Path of Exile. This project ended up being a lot longer than expected. I thought of breaking it up into a multi-part series, but I think it works best as a giant comprehensive course on Leech mechanics. If you're just looking for a quick rundown of how the main Leech stats work, you can skip to the Summary of Leech Modifiers section of the video. If you're an experienced player who already has a good grip on Leech mechanics, you may want to skip ahead to the patch 3.14 Leech changes section, as even veterans may learn a thing or two from that point onward. If you want to hear me go into detail about every aspect of Leech, just keep watching. If there are any technical inaccuracies, I will make corrections in a pinned comment, so please check for that comment before proceeding. This video is based on the current patch, 3.14. If any future changes make parts of this video obsolete, I may make follow-up content, but I'm hoping that this will at least be comprehensive for the current patch. I'll start by explaining what Leech is, then break down how Leech is scaled, and finally discuss various ways to change the rules and make Leech work differently. In Path of Exile, Leech refers to a type of recovery over time that is based on damage dealt by hits. There are currently 3 types of Leech, one for each of the 3 main resources. Life Leech recovers life over time, Mana Leech recovers mana over time, and Energy Shield Leech recovers energy shield over time. Leech is just one source of recovery and should not be confused with other sources of recovery. For example, Regeneration is also recovery, but it is not Leech. Modifiers to recovery may apply to either Leech or Regeneration, but modifiers specific to Leech do not affect Regeneration, and modifiers specific to Regeneration do not affect Leech. Some other independent forms of recovery include recovery from flasks, energy shield recharge, and gained on hit modifiers. Gained on hit is an example of instant recovery, as opposed to recovery over time, such as Leech. This list is not exhaustive. There are other forms of recovery. You can only leech from damage from hits. You cannot leech from damage over time. For example, let's say you have a modifier granting you fire damage leeched as life. You then hit an enemy with Fireball, which deals fire damage on hit. The hit also inflicts Ignite, which deals fire damage over time. You leech a percentage of the hit damage as life, but do not leech from the Ignite damage, because leech does not apply to damage over time. There are 3 steps in leech calculations: damage, leech, and recovery. The calculations are done in that order, and it's important to know that these are 3 different things. Let's start with the damage step. The input for leech calculations is the damage dealt by the hit. Specifically, Leech uses post-mitigation damage, meaning the actual damage taken by the enemy, after things like resistances and armor are applied. In my videos on Petrified Blood, I made a distinction between taking damage and losing life. Leech is based on damage taken by the defender, and not on the amount removed from the defender's HP. This is why you can still leech from bosses during invulnerability phases, and enemies affected by Allies Cannot Die auras. The targets are still taking damage, but not losing life. You are leeching from the damage, even if that damage is not causing life loss. After the defender's damage taken is determined, the game calculates how much of that damage is leeched as life, mana, and/or energy shield. These amounts are based on all of your relevant percent of damage leeched modifiers. They are also affected by any modifiers that specifically prevent leech, such as the of congealment map suffix. There are far too many types of percent of damage leeched modifiers, and places to find them for me to talk about all of them. However, one trend I should point out is that mana leech is almost always limited to attacks. This is an intentional balance decision to make caster builds' mana recovery reliant on things other than leech, such as regeneration and flasks. When you leech a percentage of damage from a hit, this does not subtract the leeched amount from the damage you deal. If you deal 100 damage and leech 1% of damage as life, you will still deal 100 damage, not 99 damage. As an example of how life leech is calculated from damage dealt, let's say you hit an enemy with an attack, dealing 3,000 physical damage and 1,000 fire damage after mitigation. Let's also say you have 4% of physical damage leeched as life, 2% of attack damage leeched as life, and 1% of attack damage leeched as mana. The result is a single instance of life leech and a single instance of mana leech. You leech life equal to 4% of 3,000 plus 2% of 4,000, totaling 200 damage leeched as life. You leech mana equal to 1% of 4,000, or 40 damage leeched as mana. Once the game knows how much of each resource is leeched, it then attempts to recover resources based on the amounts leeched. The amount that you recover is not necessarily equal to the amount that you leech. It may be equal, but it can also be less or more. Most leech-related modifiers don't actually affect the amount leeched. Instead, they directly affect the recovery granted by leech. Although different leech stats do different things, they unfortunately sound similar. I'm going to try to introduce each of these one by one, and build up from simple examples. Leech exists for each type of resource, but in our examples we will focus on life leech without loss of generality. I will point out any situations where there are mechanical differences between the three types of Leech. Otherwise, feel free to extend any explanations of Life Leech to Mana Leech or Energy Shield Leech. I'll start by explaining how a single instance of Leech functions, before extending that to having multiple instances of Leech at once. The amount of recovery granted by an instance of Leech is equal to the amount of life leeched from the hit, unless that amount is greater than 10% of maximum life. If you leech more than 10% of your maximum life from one hit, the subsequent recovery will be capped at 10% of maximum life. This 10% cap is called maximum recovery per life leech. Let's do a case study. For simplicity's sake, let's say you have 10,000 maximum life and 3,000 current life. You have 1% of damage leeched as life, and you hit an enemy dealing 60,000 damage after mitigation. Since 1% of 60,000 is 600, you will leech 600 life. So that I can reuse this example later, let's call it Scenario A. 10,000 maximum life, 3,000 current life, and 600 life leeched, with no further modifications to leech behavior. For the rest of this video, I will use a bright green border for the leech modifiers that the player has. This should help you see which parts of the process you can control. With 10,000 life, your maximum recovery per life leech is 10% of that, which is 1,000 life. The 600 life leeched is now compared to this amount. Since 600 is less than 1,000, and the lower value is taken, 600 is the amount that this instance of Leech will attempt to recover. Now recall that Leech provides recovery over time, not instant recovery. A single instance of Leech will recover 2% of maximum life per second. This rate, combined with the amount of life recovered, will determine the duration of the instance. In this example, 2% of 10,000 life is 200 life, which means that this instance of Leech will recover 200 life per second. To determine the duration of the Leech instance, the game divides the 600 life recovered by the 200 life recovered per second, resulting in a 3-second duration. The final result is an instance of Leech that recovers 200 life per second for 3 seconds. I've highlighted these two values in red to indicate that they are the two outputs of all these calculations. Ultimately, the Leech instance has only these two properties, a rate and a duration. They are determined when the damage is dealt and cannot be modified after the instance is created. This 600 life recovered value is not stored while the instance is active. While the instance persists, the game tracks the remaining duration and recovers life based on the rate. The Leech instance no longer knows how much total life it was meant to recover, or how much it has recovered so far. To properly demonstrate the 10% Leech cap, let's use Scenario B, which is identical to Scenario A, except that now you have 5% of damage leeched as life, so that you leech 3,000 life instead of 600. 3,000 is greater than 1,000, so 1,000 is the value that is kept. In other words, even though you've leeched 3,000 life, the recovery from the subsequent Leech instance is only 1,000 life due to the 10% cap. This 1,000 life is then divided by the 200 life per second to determine the duration of the Leech instance, which is 5 seconds. Like life recovery from flasks, life recovery from Leech is removed when you reach full life. As with flask recovery, full life in this case refers to your maximum unreserved life, not your actual maximum life. To illustrate that, let's change Scenario B so that you start at 9,200 life instead of 3,000 life. You still leech 1,000 life, and therefore gain an instance of Leech with a rate of 200 life per second and a duration of 5 seconds. Assuming you don't gain or lose life from any other effects, you should reach full life after only 4 seconds. When this happens, the Leech instance is removed before it expires. Thus, this instance of Leech will have recovered only 800 life, even though its properties were determined based on recovering 1,000 life. If you take this same situation and also reserve 200 life, your unreserved life is now 9,800. This is the new point at which the Leech instance is removed. Now the Leech instance will be removed after 3 seconds, recovering only 600 out of the 1,000 life that it wanted to recover. Notice that the properties of the Leech instance are not affected by the life reservation. It still has a rate of 200 life per second, even though life is reserved. This is because the Leech rate is based on the full 10,000 life and not on the unreserved 9,800. This is an especially important distinction from Mana Leech, since nearly all builds that use Mana Leech reserve the overwhelming majority of their mana pools. Reserving 90% of maximum mana does not reduce Mana Leech rate by 90%, since the Leech rate is based on your actual maximum mana, not on the 10% that is unreserved. It is always possible to create a new Leech instance, even while on full life. However, any Life Leech instances created while on full life will be immediately removed, because that's the default behavior of a Leech instance. To summarize so far, when you leech life from a hit, you create an instance of Life Leech that recovers life over time. The amount of life recovery that an instance of Leech attempts to recover is equal to either the amount of life leeched or 10% of your maximum life, whichever is lower. That amount of life recovery is then divided by the leech recovery rate, which is 2% of maximum life per second, to determine the duration of the leech instance. You will then recover 2% of your maximum life per second until either the duration of the leech instance expires or your unreserved life is filled. Mana Leech and Energy Shield Leech work the same way. Now that we've established the behavior of a single instance of Leech, let's see what happens when you create more than one. Performing multiple successful hits will create multiple instances of Leech. For example, hitting 3 enemies with a single attack will create 3 instances of Leech. Hitting 1 enemy 3 times will also create 3 instances of Leech. Hitting 3 enemies 3 times will create 9 instances of Leech. There is no limit to the number of Leech instances that can be active at one time. Instances of Leech do not overwrite one another. Each Leech instance recovers resources independently and continues to do so until either it expires or it is removed due to the resource being filled. Each instance has its own specified duration and recovery rate. There is currently no way to make different active Leech instances of the same type have different recovery rates, but the game does not technically prevent this. For now, the recovery rate of an instance of Leech is always 2% of maximum per second. Let's take scenario B, where 200 life is recovered per second for 5 seconds. This time, 2 seconds into the recovery duration, you hit an enemy again, gaining another instance of Leech that recovers 200 life per second for 5 seconds. The second instance does not overwrite the first instance. Instead, for the first 2 seconds, you will recover 200 life per second, just like before. Then, when the next instance of Leech kicks in, you will have 2 separate sources of 200 life recovery per second, for a total of 400 life recovered per second. This will continue for 3 seconds until the first instance of Leech expires. After that, you will recover 200 life per second until the second instance of Leech expires. Altogether, after 7 seconds, you will have recovered 2,000 life, 1,000 from each hit. Each individual instance of Leech is independent, applying its recovery as though the other instance weren't there. The game tracks the total recovery rate from all active Leech instances with the variable total recovery per second. In this example, for the first 2 seconds, the value of total recovery per second from Life Leech is 200. It is then 400 for 3 seconds, and 200 for 2 seconds, before returning to 0. If there were 3 active Leech instances, the value of total recovery per second from Life Leech would be 600. If there were 5, the value would be 1000. Although there is no limit to the number of active Leech instances, there is a limit to the rate at which you can recover life from Leech. Leech can recover at most 20% of your maximum life per second. This cap is called maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. In this example, the value of maximum total life recovery per second from Leech is 2000, since that's 20% of 10,000. This limit is what players typically refer to when talking about a Leech cap in Path of Exile. Since each instance of Leech recovers 2% of maximum life per second, and life recovery from Leech is capped at 20% of maximum life per second, it takes exactly 10 active Leech instances to reach the Leech cap. You can always create new instances of Leech, even while Leech capped. At the Leech cap, Leech instances can begin and expire as usual, and the behavior of individual Leech instances is unchanged. All the Leech cap does is apply a maximum to the total amount of life recovery per second from all active Leech instances. The only thing that can disrupt existing Life Leech instances is the life bar being filled. It can still be helpful to create new instances of Leech while Leech capped, so that you can maintain maximum recovery per second if the current instances expire. Let's go back to scenario B, except now, instead of hitting once, you hit 6 enemies simultaneously. I will now refer to this as scenario C. In scenario C, you simultaneously gain 6 instances of Life Leech, each granting 200 life recovery per second for 5 seconds. The recovery per second of all these instances is added up so that your total recovery per second from Life Leech is 1200. Because you have 10,000 maximum life, your maximum total life recovery per second from Leech is 20% of that, which is 2000. Since 1200 is less than 2000, your recovery per second value is set to the lower value of 1200, and you recover 1200 life per second for 5 seconds. So what happens when you hit 16 enemies instead of 6? Let's call this scenario D. The 16 active Leech instances would add up to 3,200 life recovered per second. However, 3,200 is greater than 2,000, so total recovery per second is set to 2,000, and you recover 2,000 life per second for 5 seconds. Importantly, the maximum total recovery per second leech cap is the only stat whose base value is not the same for all three resources. Life, mana, and energy shield have the same 10% cap on the net amount recovered from a single instance of Leech. They also all recover 2% per second per instance of Leech. However, the cap on total recovery per second is lower for energy shield than it is for life and mana. The maximum total recovery per second caps are 20% of maximum life, 20% of maximum mana, and 10% of maximum energy shield. This means that since each instance of Energy Shield Leech recovers 2% of maximum energy shield per second, you reach maximum recovery per second with only 5 instances of Energy Shield Leech, compared to 10 active instances for Life and Mana Leech. Also, notice that I do not call the second column Total Recovery per Second. Total Recovery per Second refers to the sum of recovery per second from all active instances. It isn't possible to specify a fixed value in this table for Total Recovery per Second, because it's proportional to the number of active Leech instances. Lastly, I should point out that so far my explanation of the Leech cap has been slightly oversimplified. Maximum total life recovery per second from Leech does not technically cap the value of total recovery per second from Life Leech. What it actually caps is total life recovery per second from Leech, which sounds nearly identical, but is determined slightly later in the calculations. In the scenarios we've discussed so far, and in the vast majority of other situations, this distinction is inconsequential. However, there are some builds for which the distinction matters. I'll get into the details of this when I break down the 3.14 Leech changes later in the video. For now, assume that recovery from Life Leech and life recovery from Leech are the same thing. With that out of the way, let's get into how you can improve your recovery from Leech. All of the Leech recovery variables I've mentioned so far are base values. There are modifiers in various places that can affect these values. I will now go through these one by one, showing where to find related modifiers and describing their effects mathematically. Let's start with the maximum recovery per Leech variable. Recall that this is the value that caps how much recovery can be granted by a single instance of Leech. Of the 3 stats that govern Leech's behavior, this one has the fewest available modifiers. To my knowledge, there are 2 ways to increase it for Life Leech: the Slayer's Brutal Fervor node and the Divergent Life Leech support gem. For Energy Shield Leech, the only one I'm aware of is the Divergent Energy Leech support gem. I'm not aware of any way to increase the 10% cap for mana. 100% increased maximum recovery per Life Leech allows a single instance of Leech to recover 20% of maximum life instead of 10%. Since that instance recovers 2% of maximum life per second, its duration can be 10 seconds instead of 5, provided you leech enough life from the hit to reach the new cap. There are several items with modifiers that reduce maximum recovery per Leech. For Life Leech, there are 2, Offering to the Serpent and Replica Soul Strike. For Energy Shield Leech, there is 1, Essentia Sanguis. To my knowledge, there is none for Mana Leech. Reductions to maximum recovery per Leech provide no apparent benefits to the player, so they only seem to show up as compromises for powerful benefits. Replica Soul Strike reduces maximum recovery per Life Leech by 80%. With Replica Soul Strike alone, 1 instance of Life Leech will only try to recover at best 2% of maximum life. At 2% of maximum life per second, that instance of Leech can have a duration of up to 1 second. This makes Replica Soul Strike an extraordinarily difficult item to use, unless, for example, you're playing a Slayer with Brutal Fervor. Since increased and reduced modifiers are additive with one another, the minus 80% and the plus 100% add together, and you end up with 20% increased maximum recovery per Life Leech. Thus, with this combo, an instance of Life Leech can recover 12% of maximum life, and therefore have a maximum duration of 6 seconds. Just for some more concrete numbers, let's see what effect this Brutal Fervor Replica Soul Strike combo has on some of our previous examples. In Scenario A, 600 life is leeched from a hit. The maximum recovery per Life Leech value is unmodified, and therefore equal to 10% of maximum life, or 1000 life. Since 600 is less than 1000, the 10% cap is inconsequential, and altogether 600 life is recovered. The result is an instance of Leech lasting 3 seconds and granting 200 life recovered per second. Now, with 20% increased maximum recovery per Life Leech, the 1000 life cap is increased to 1200 life. However, since the original 1000 life cap was not reached in the first place, the cap increase does nothing. You still recover 200 life per second for 3 seconds. Now let's try this with scenario B. In the original scenario B, you leech 3000 life. Since that is greater than the 1000 cap, 1000 life is recovered, giving 200 life per second for 5 seconds. With the cap increased to 1200 life, the 3000 life leeched still exceeds the new cap. Thus, the instance has a duration of 6 seconds and a rate of 200 life per second. As I said earlier, every instance of Leech has two properties, a rate and a duration. The easiest way to explain the maximum recovery per life leech stat is that it determines the maximum duration of a Leech instance, but not its rate. 20% increased maximum recovery per life leech is essentially a 20% increase to the maximum possible duration of one instance. The increase does nothing for you if you aren't leeching enough life from a hit to create 5-second instances anyway. However, if you are leeching enough from a hit to create instances of Leech lasting longer than 5 seconds, this modifier will allow you to do so. Also, increasing this stat can be valuable for builds that can leech life instantly. More on instant leech later. Okay, on to the next stat, total recovery per second. Recall that this refers to the sum of all recovery per second that comes from all active Leech instances. There is an abundance of available modifiers to this value on the skill tree. Every Leech-centric cluster for life, mana, or energy shield on the skill tree contains modifiers to total recovery per second. Some other ways to modify this stat include Harvest Jewel implicits, Synthesized Amulet implicits, this Crusader prefix on rings, an Essence of Hysteria craft on an amulet, and Warped Timepiece. Additionally, both the Vaal Pact Keystone and the Highwayman unique ring double your total recovery per second from Life Leech. Although I haven't tested this, I believe that these doubling modifiers do not stack, since doubled in Path of Exile is usually a boolean. Either something is doubled, or it isn't. As for negative modifiers, I'm not aware of anything that can directly lower your total recovery per second values. To avoid confusion, I should note that many of the modifiers to total recovery per second were renamed in patch 3.14 to refer to recovery per second, instead of total recovery per second. In particular, this seemed to affect nearly all cases for Life Leech and Energy Shield Leech, but none for Mana Leech. I asked Mark about this, and he clarified that this change in wording is unintended and will be reverted soon. With that out of the way, let's cover how this modifier works. The previously discussed modifiers to maximum recovery per Leech affect the duration of a Leech instance. On the other hand, a modifier to total recovery per second does not affect duration. It actually doesn't affect individual instances at all. Instead, it applies to the total amount of recovery per second from all active Leech instances. Essentially, increased total recovery per second makes you recover faster, but only if you're below the Leech cap. Let's jump into some examples. Let's start with scenario C, which has 6 concurrent Life Leech instances. The 6 instances provide a total of 1200 life recovery per second for 5 seconds. The cap on total recovery per second is 2000, and therefore inconsequential. The 1200 life per second in this scenario is the base value for total recovery per second from Life Leech. Now, let's add a modifier granting 50% increased total recovery per second from Life Leech, which multiplies that base value. What this does is increase the base value of 1200 life recovered per second to 1800 life recovered per second. This modifier does not increase the cap of 2000 life per second, but 1800 is less than 2000 anyway, so the cap remains inconsequential. Again, this modifier does not affect individual Leech instances in any way. It only affects the total amount of recovery per second granted by the sum of all active instances. Upstream in the calculations, each of the 6 Leech instances still thinks it's recovering 200 life per second for 5 seconds, even though downstream 1800 life per second is recovered by the player. Now on to scenario D, where the 16 Leech instances combine for 3200 life per second, which ends up being capped at 2000. 50% increased total recovery per second from Life Leech increases the 3200 life per second to 4800 life per second. But total recovery per second remains capped at 2000, so the modifier provides no additional recovery per second here. With this example, I don't mean to imply that it's pointless to increase total recovery per second if you're going to be Leech capped anyway. Increasing total recovery per second means you can reach the Leech cap with fewer hits. Depending on your build, this could be useful. In fact, I would argue that this is the primary benefit of investing in total recovery per second modifiers. In the previous example, only 7 active Leech instances are required to reach the Leech cap, instead of 10. The final Leech variable that can be modified is maximum total recovery per second. Recall that the base value of maximum total recovery per second is 20% for life and mana, and 10% for energy shield. For most Leech-centric builds, this Leech cap is the most important value to pay attention to, as it often has the largest impact on how quickly you can recover to full life after taking damage. Increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech is not easy to maximize. It can currently be found in a handful of places, all with relatively high opportunity costs. On the passive tree, you can raise the life Leech cap with certain Leech clusters, the Adrenaline Cluster Jewel notable, and the Berserker's Defy Pain notable. There's also Vaal Pact, which doubles the life Leech cap. On items, there are influenced and synthesized modifiers on gloves and amulets, and Replica Soul Strike. Increased maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech exists on 2 passive tree notables and on the Conservation of Energy Cluster Jewel notable. Additionally, the Ghost Reaver keystone doubles the energy shield Leech cap. On items, there are influenced gloves, influenced and synthesized amulets, and this Watcher's Eye affix. Increased maximum total mana recovery per second from Leech shows up on these 2 skill tree notables, and on synthesized implicits for gloves and amulets. To my knowledge, the only things that lower Leech caps are Eternal Youth, which cuts the life Leech cap in half, and Wicked Ward, which cuts the energy shield Leech cap in half. I don't think anything lowers the mana Leech cap. To demonstrate the effect of increasing the life Leech cap, let's revisit the previous 2 scenarios, this time allocating passives in the Hematophagy and Vitality Void clusters, combining for 45% increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. This takes the previous value of 2,000 maximum total life recovery per second, and increases it to 2,900 maximum total life recovery per second. In scenario C, this does nothing. Total life recovery per second from Life Leech is less than the cap of 2,000, so increasing the cap has no effect. However, in scenario D, there are 16 active instances, and the uncapped value of total life recovery per second is 4,800. With the corresponding cap raised to 2,900, you will now recover 2,900 life per second instead of 2,000 life per second. Here is a summary of the modifiers that govern Leech's behavior. When you hit an enemy, you leech life based on your damage dealt and your damage leeched as life stats. This creates an instance of Leech that recovers life over time. The amount of life you can gain from a single instance of Leech is limited by your maximum recovery per life Leech value, whose base is 10% of maximum life. After this cap is applied, the value is then used to determine the duration of the Leech instance. An instance of Life Leech will always recover 2% of maximum life per second. Because by default an instance of Leech can recover any amount up to 10% of maximum life, its duration can be any amount up to 5 seconds. There is no limit to the number of active Leech instances, but there is a limit to how quickly your life can be recovered by Leech. The 2% recovery rates from all active instances are added together to form your base total recovery per second from Life Leech value. This total recovery rate is capped by your maximum total life recovery per second from Leech value, whose base is 20% of maximum life. This means that by default it takes 10 active Leech instances to be Leech capped. Generally, when people refer to a Leech cap in Path of Exile, they're referring to this 20% cap on recovery per second, not the 10% cap on recovery per instance. Mana Leech and Energy Shield Leech function identically to Life Leech, except that maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech is capped at 10% instead of 20%. This means that Energy Shield has a lower Leech cap than Life and Mana Leech. By default, it takes only 5 active Energy Shield Leech instances to reach Energy Shield's Leech cap, instead of 10. Here's a quick rundown of how to invest in different Leech stats. Damage leeched as life modifiers raise the duration of Leech instances, up to a cap. Investing more than the bare minimum into this stat can be good for builds that deal low damage per hit and do not reach the cap on recovery per instance. For example, some bleeding and poison builds, and many Quinn 69 builds, may struggle to deal enough damage with hits and will create Leech instances that expire too quickly. Increased maximum recovery per life Leech can make your Leech last longer if you deal enough damage to reach the default duration cap. This is best for builds with persistent life Leech, which I'll explain in more detail later. It's generally not a helpful stat for many other builds, because you usually don't want to remain below full life for longer than 5 seconds anyway. This stat is also helpful for instant Leech builds, which I'll also cover later. Increased total recovery per second from Life Leech does not affect duration, but amplifies Leech's recovery rate, as long as you're below the Leech cap. It's generally a good stat, but it's most important on builds that hit slowly, such as two-handed slam builds. It can take a while to build up to 10 active Leech instances on a slam build, so investing in this stat can mitigate that issue by letting you cap your Leech with fewer hits. Increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech raises the Leech cap itself. This is a good stat for any build that reaches the Leech rate cap, which should be just about any build that uses Leech as its primary form of recovery. It's especially good on builds with persistent Leech, since those builds can remain at the Leech cap for long periods of time. Although everything in this table refers to Life Leech, the same logic will apply to Energy Shield and Mana Leech, so go ahead and extrapolate. If you use Path of Building, you can go to the Calcs window and find a helpful breakdown of your Leech behavior. It factors in things like damage, maximum life, and attack speed to tell you what your Leech cap is, whether you can reach it, and how long you're expected to take to reach the Leech cap by continuously attacking. Shout out to everybody who keeps Path of Building updated. I don't think I could theorycraft without it anymore. If you don't use Path of Building, check the description for a link to the Path of Building community site. Next, we need to talk about generic modifiers to recovery rate, which are not technically Leech modifiers, but are nonetheless very impactful to Leech-centric builds. Modifiers to recovery rate affect all forms of recovery over time: regeneration, recharge, Leech, flask recovery, recoup, the agnostic, etc. They do not affect instant recovery, such as gain on hit modifiers and recover on kill modifiers. Due to how strong they are, there are relatively few places to find generic increases to recovery rate. Influenced modifiers to life, mana, or energy shield recovery rate exist on body armors and belts. Synthesized alternatives for life, mana, and energy shield recovery rate exist for belts, and synthesized alternatives for energy shield recovery rate specifically can be found for body armor. Other sources include Replica at Sirius Foible, Machina Mitts, Beast Fur Shawl, Harbinger Belts, these Watcher's Eye affixes, Transcendent Incursion Jewels, and the Necromancer's Bone Barrier notable. Additionally, there are some exceptionally high but conditional bonuses to recovery rate. These include the upgraded Soul of Aracali Pantheon bonus, and Ascendancy passives such as Patient Reaper, Tessalio Cleansing Water, and the Ascendant's Trickster node. Recovery rate modifiers are relevant mostly to builds that stack very high amounts of recovery. For example, Righteous Fire builds stack life regeneration, Archmage builds stack mana regeneration, Indigon builds stack flask recovery, and Slayers often stack bonuses to the life leech cap. All of these builds especially benefit from recovery rate modifiers. There are some recovery rate modifiers that are relevant to virtually everyone, namely modifiers that lower recovery rates instead of raising them. The most annoying of these is the Of Smothering map mod, which, with a High Awakening bonus, can give you up to 76% less recovery rate of life and energy shield. Other penalties to recovery rate can be found in specific encounters, such as Ultimatum encounters or the Maven boss fight, whose rotating beams set recovery rates for life and energy shield to 0. The reason recovery rate modifiers are so impactful is that they apply to recovery over time from all sources. For example, if you're simultaneously getting life recovery from regeneration, leech, and flasks, your increased life recovery rate modifier will multiply the recovery over time from all three sources. This step happens after all the leech calculations we've discussed so far, including the application of maximum total life recovery per second from leech. This means that life recovery rate modifiers do not respect the leech cap. By this point in the calculations, the game no longer cares what the leech cap is, or how much recovery is coming from leech versus other sources. All it does is modify the total according to your recovery rate modifiers. Let's illustrate this by taking the previous example and adding a 50% increased life recovery rate modifier. That's in line with the amount granted by the Chieftain's Tessalio Cleansing Water passive. Adding this bonus on to the previous example, the 50% increased life recovery rate applies after all leech modifiers, increasing the 2900 life per second to 4350 life per second. Recovery rate modifiers change neither the duration of leech nor how many instances are needed to reach the cap, since both of those things depend on upstream calculations. Therefore, an increase to recovery rate is functionally better than a direct increase to the leech cap, since increasing the leech cap also requires you to create more leech instances to reach the new cap. You probably want both anyway, though. Just for fun, let's add in an Of Smothering map mod with a maxed out Awakening bonus. This means 76% less life recovery rate, which turns the 4350 life recovery into 1044. As you can see, this map mod can be very debilitating for builds that rely on recovery over time to stay alive. Remember that recovery rate modifiers have no effect on instant recovery. For example, if you have 50 life gained on hit, or 3% life recovered on kill, neither bonuses nor penalties to life recovery rate will change the amount of life gained. As I hinted at earlier, it is possible to make Leech persist even when its respective resource has been filled. This allows each Leech instance to expire properly, instead of being removed prematurely. For Life Leech, there are several ways to prevent Leech instances from being removed at full life. The modifier Life Leech effects are not removed at full life can be found on the Slayer's Brutal Fervor node, the Ascendant's Slayer node, the Offering to the Serpent gloves, and the Immortal Ambition keystone. Immortal Ambition can be obtained through the Glorious Vanity Timeless Jewel, the Soul Tether belt, or the Mahuxotl's Machination shield. As for Energy Shield, currently the only way to prevent Energy Shield Leech from being removed at full Energy Shield is by using the Essentia Sanguis Claw. There is currently no way to prevent Mana Leech from being removed at full mana. Recall that instances of Leech can still be created while your resources are full. Normally, when you create an instance of Leech while on full life, that instance is immediately removed. If you prevent this from happening, the instance will remain until its duration has expired. With Persistent Leech, while on full life, Life Leech does not pause and wait for you to take more damage again. Each instance of Leech will continue to attempt to recover life, even if there is none left to recover. Leech instances can still begin and end normally while your life is filled. If your Leech has a 5-second duration, you can't spend 30 seconds out of combat with a full life bar, then take a hit and expect your Life Leech to top you off without creating new instances of Leech. It used to be possible to create instances of Leech lasting several minutes, but now there's a cap on recovery per instance, which is effectively a cap on duration. Persistent Leech provides several significant benefits. Without Persistent Leech, anytime you take damage from full life, you need to hit enemies afterward to leech back to full life. With Persistent Leech, as long as you've hit enemies recently enough that you still have ongoing Leech instances, you can basically treat Leech as though it were regeneration, always at work, even while out of combat. This is especially nice for boss encounters, where it can take longer to stack up Leech instances, and where boss mechanics can prevent you from dealing damage for several seconds at a time. Persistent Leech allows you to reliably benefit from conditional modifiers that only apply while leeching. There are many of these, but some noteworthy examples include those on the Slayer's Brutal Fervor and Endless Hunger notables, the Energy Leech support gem, this Veiled and Crafted mod for gloves and amulets, and these Cluster Jewel notables. You can also get Persistent Leech with the Petrified Blood skill. Petrified Blood prevents all life recovery, except flask recovery, from applying to the top half of your life pool. This prevents you from leeching to full life, provided that you don't reserve more than 50% of your maximum life. Since Life Leech effects are only removed at full life, not half-life, your Life Leech instances will persist until either they expire or you use flasks to recover to full life. Petrified Blood is build-defining, and does far more than enable this interaction, so I would absolutely not recommend using it just for Persistent Leech. For more info on Petrified Blood, watch the other videos that I made on that skill specifically. It is also possible to make Leech apply its recovery instantly, instead of over time. When you leech instantly, instead of the recovery being applied at 2% per second, all recovery occurs immediately when the damage is dealt. Instant Leech is not to be confused with Gain on Hit, which is a different form of instant recovery that does not count as Leech. There is currently one way to obtain Instant Leech: Bloodseeker, whose attacks create Life Leech instances that cause instant recovery. There is currently no way to make Mana Leech or Energy Shield Leech recover instantly. Instant Leech is still limited by your maximum recovery per Life Leech value, which means one hit can only recover 10% of life by default. This makes increased maximum recovery per Life Leech an exceptionally good stat on Bloodseeker builds, provided you can leech enough to take advantage of it. For example, with the Slayer's Brutal Fervor notable, Bloodseeker can instantly recover up to 20% of maximum life from one hit, instead of 10%. Because Instant Leech does not recover life over time, it does not benefit from any modifiers that affect Leech recovery rate. There is no rate to modify. Any investment into raising total recovery per second from Life Leech, maximum total life recovery per second from Leech, or life recovery rate will have no effect on Instant Leech. This does go the other way, though. The Of Smothering map mod has no effect on Instant Leech because it only applies to recovery over time. If you rely primarily on instant recovery, you can essentially ignore that map mod. Since Instant Leech has no duration, it cannot enable while leeching effects. You can still benefit from while leeching effects if you're gaining Life Leech instances through other means. For example, if you have Bloodseeker in one hand and a different weapon in your other hand, Bloodseeker will leech instantly in the other weapon over time. Because Instant Leech is unaffected by modifiers to recovery per second, it has some specific synergy with the Immortal Ambition keystone, and subsequently with Mahuxotl's Machination. I'll explain both of those synergies later in the video. The oldest and most prominent keystone passives dealing with Leech are Vaal Pact and Ghost Reaver, both introduced in patch 0.9.12. Both keystones, especially Vaal Pact, have been reworked multiple times since then. The current iteration of Vaal Pact doubles both your total recovery per second from Life Leech and your maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. Its downside is that it removes all life regeneration. There's a handful of different ways to gain Vaal Pact, the most straightforward of which is to simply allocate it on the passive tree. Adzere's Acuity conditionally gives Vaal Pact if you've crit recently, allowing you to benefit from regeneration while out of combat. One variant of Skin of the Lords provides Vaal Pact while equipped. Doomsower grants Vaal Pact if all of its sockets are red. Some Precursor's emblems give Vaal Pact while at maximum endurance charges. A veiled suffix on amulets and its corresponding crafted mod can give Vaal Pact while focused, allowing you to double recovery from Leech on demand. Mahuxotl's Machination grants Vaal Pact, but simultaneously negates its primary benefit, which is the doubling of the Leech cap. Now that I've mentioned Vaal Pact, I'd like to do a detailed example involving what I would consider a realistic Leech-based Slayer build. Let's say you have 8,000 life. Through a combination of passive skills and Blood Rage, you have 5.6% of damage leeched as life. Thanks to Brutal Fervor, you have 100% increased maximum recovery per life leech. Passive skills combine for 230% increased total recovery per second from life leech. From passive skills and an influenced amulet, you have 75% increased maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. You also have Vaal Pact, doubling your increased total recovery per second from life leech, and maximum total life recovery per second from Leech values. Lastly, from an influenced belt and a Watcher's Eye Jewel, you have 39% increased life recovery rate. You hit 8 enemies for 50,000 damage each. With 5.6% of damage leeched as life, you will leech 2,800 life from each hit. Since you have 8,000 maximum life, your base maximum recovery per life leech is 800, which is increased by 100% to 1,600. Thus, each instance of Leech will recover 1,600 life instead of 2,800 life. At 160 life recovery per second, each instance lasts 10 seconds. The 160 life recovery per second values from all instances are added together to get 1,280, which is your base total recovery per second from life leech stat. This is increased by 230% and then doubled, giving 8,448 total recovery per second from life leech. Your base maximum total life recovery per second from Leech is 1,600, which is increased by 75% and then doubled, giving 5,600 maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. This value caps the 8,448 life per second at 5,600 life per second. This recovery rate is then increased by 39% to 7,784 life recovered per second, which is 97.3% of life recovered per second. As you can see from this example, Vaal Pact is essential on any build that is centered around Leech, particularly if you have Persistent Leech. With Persistent Leech, you can be recovering this much life all the time, turning the 97.3% life per second into a pseudo-regeneration effect, and this isn't even that extreme of an example. You can squeeze in quite a few more increases to both your Leech cap and your life recovery rate, and boost the percentage well above 100%. However, in practice, 97% per second is more than enough Leech, so it's probably better to prioritize other stats at this point, such as sources of reliable damage mitigation. Ghost Reaver essentially serves the same purpose for Energy Shield that Vaal Pact serves for life, doubling your maximum total Energy Shield recovery per second from Leech value. This brings the Leech cap for Energy Shield in line with that of Life and Mana, since it defaults to 10% and Life and Mana default to 20%. Additionally, when using Ghost Reaver, whenever you would create an instance of Life Leech, you instead create an instance of Energy Shield Leech. In exchange for these Leech benefits, Ghost Reaver halves Energy Shield recharge rate. Aside from simply allocating the passive, you can also get Ghost Reaver through Skin of the Lords or through Essentia Sanguis. Essentia Sanguis has the additional benefit of enabling persistent Energy Shield Leech. Ghost Reaver is best used on low life or Chaos Inoculation builds that rely on Leech for recovery. Ghost Reaver is generally not well suited for hybrid life Energy Shield builds because it makes it more difficult to recover life. Ghost Reaver should also be avoided on builds that rely on Energy Shield recharge due to its harsh penalty to recharge rate. Let's say you're using the Essentia Sanguis Claw, and your main attack is linked to Divergent Energy Leech support. This is a good combo because the alternate quality bonus helps offset the reduced leech duration from Essentia Sanguis, and also because Persistent Leech allows you to benefit from both multipliers on the gem. Let's say you're also playing a low life build, with 1,000 maximum life and 8,000 maximum energy shield. For simplicity's sake, we'll say you have 5% of damage leeched as life, and 2% of damage leeched as energy shield. Essentia Sanguis and Divergent Energy Leech support combine for 10% reduced maximum recovery per energy shield leech. Passive skills for claws give 70% increased total recovery per second from Life Leech. On the skill tree, you have 30% increased maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech, from anointing the Ethereal Feast notable. Essentia Sanguis grants Ghost Reaver, which doubles the energy shield leech cap, and makes you leech energy shield instead of life. Lastly, you have 15% increased energy shield recovery rate from a Watcher's Eye Jewel. You hit 7 enemies for 20,000 damage each. Without Ghost Reaver, each hit would create 1 instance of 1,000 Life Leech and 1 instance of 400 Energy Shield Leech. With Ghost Reaver, each hit instead creates 2 separate instances of Energy Shield Leech, 1 for 1,000 Energy Shield and 1 for 400 Energy Shield. Because both of these count as instances of Energy Shield Leech, they are scaled by your Energy Shield Leech values and unaffected by Life Leech values. Since you have 8,000 maximum Energy Shield, your base maximum recovery per Energy Shield Leech is 800. The 10% reduced maximum recovery per Energy Shield Leech lowers this to 720. Thus, the instance of 1,000 Energy Shield Leech is capped at 720 recovery, while the other is unaffected and maintains its 400 recovery. Each instance recovers 160 energy shield per second, which means that one instance has a duration of 4.5 seconds and the other a duration of 2.5 seconds. Altogether, from each hit, there are 2 instances of Energy Shield Leech, one lasting 4.5 seconds, the other lasting 2.5 seconds, and both recovering 160 energy shield per second. Adding together the recovery rates of all 14 instances from the 7 hits, your base total recovery per second from Energy Shield Leech is 2,240. This is where increased total recovery per second from Energy Shield Leech modifiers would apply, but you have none, so we go straight to applying the Leech cap. Your base maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech is 800. This is increased by 30% before being doubled by Ghost Reaver. Therefore, your base energy shield recovery rate from Leech is 2080. Finally, the 15% increased energy shield recovery rate modifier is applied here, increasing your recovery to 2392 per second. Notice that neither your maximum life nor any modifiers specific to Life Leech impact the Leech calculations, because there aren't any instances of Life Leech. Bloodseeker cannot make Energy Shield Leech from Ghost Reaver apply instantly. Bloodseeker only affects instances of Life Leech, but Ghost Reaver causes you to create instances of Energy Shield Leech instead. If you hit an enemy with Bloodseeker, and Ghost Reaver causes you to leech Energy Shield instead of Life, Energy Shield will be recovered over time, just as in the previous example. The next Leech-related keystone that needs to be discussed is Immortal Ambition, which works unlike anything else in the game currently. You're probably wondering what makes it so unique. To answer that, we need to talk about patch 3.14 and the Leech changes that came with it. In patch 3.14, all references to maximum total recovery per second from Life Leech were changed to maximum total life recovery per second from Leech. The same change was made to Energy Shield Leech and Mana Leech descriptions. This is not an arbitrary or accidental change. This is an intentional rephrasing of one Leech stat that reflects a distinct change in its mechanics. Briefly going back to one of our previous examples, there is technically an extra step right here in the calculations, where total recovery per second from Life Leech turns into total life recovery per second from Leech. Notice how the phrasing on these two terms matches exactly now. I've omitted this step from all examples so far because, although it is always done in-game, it has been inconsequential in the previous scenarios. However, the distinction between recovery from Life Leech and life recovery from Leech will be relevant from this point forward. Recovery from Life Leech and life recovery from Leech are effectively the same thing most of the time. This is because, by default, Life Leech recovers only life. Likewise, Mana Leech recovers only mana, and Energy Shield Leech recovers only Energy Shield. However, the game technically permits leeching one resource and recovering another. The only way that this is currently possible is through the Immortal Ambition keystone, which can make instances of Life Leech recover Energy Shield instead. Other similar mechanics may be introduced in the future. When Life Leech recovers Energy Shield, the recovery still counts as recovery from Life Leech, and not recovery from Energy Shield Leech, because it still comes from instances of Life Leech. This means that the modifiers increased maximum recovery per Life Leech and increased total recovery per second from Life Leech still apply to this Leech, even though it recovers Energy Shield. Both of those modifiers still specify Life Leech. However, because the target of the recovery is not your life pool, it does not count as life recovery from Leech. Now it counts as Energy Shield recovery from Leech. In this example, both recovery from Life Leech and recovery from Energy Shield Leech contribute to Energy Shield recovery from Leech. The Leech change in 3.14 made it so that the maximum total recovery per second Leech caps now limit the values in this column instead of the ones in this column. This is reflected in the new descriptions of the Leech cap modifiers. For example, the Leech cap for life no longer specifies that the recovery comes from Life Leech. It now applies to all life recovery from any type of leech. There is currently no way to make Mana Leech or Energy Shield Leech recover life, but the new system does not exclude that possibility. Going back to our example where Life Leech recovers Energy Shield, because this counts as Energy Shield recovery from Leech, it is limited by maximum total Energy Shield recovery per second from Leech. Prior to patch 3.14, this Leech would have instead been limited by maximum total recovery per second from Life Leech. Now we're ready to break down Immortal Ambition properly. I mentioned earlier that Immortal Ambition prevents Life Leech from being removed at full life. Additionally, while on full life, Life Leech recovers Energy Shield instead of life. Immortal Ambition also disables Energy Shield regeneration and recharge, makes your Energy Shield start at 0, and causes you to lose 5% of maximum Energy Shield per second. Immortal Ambition does not function the same way as Ghost Reaver, despite their effects sounding similar. Immortal Ambition's transition to Energy Shield occurs much later in the Leech calculations than Ghost Reaver's transition does. Ghost Reaver makes you create instances of Energy Shield Leech instead of instances of Life Leech. On the other hand, Immortal Ambition permits the creation of Life Leech instances, but alters their behavior so that they recover Energy Shield. This behavior alteration occurs only when you are on full life. With Immortal Ambition, the recovery you get from Life Leech is dynamically applied to either life or Energy Shield, depending on whether your life is currently filled. If you have any ongoing recovery from Life Leech when reaching full life, that Life Leech will immediately switch to recovering Energy Shield. If you then lose life, the Life Leech will begin recovering life again. If your Energy Shield is filled, the Life Leech will still not be removed. Life Leech can only be removed upon reaching full life, not full Energy Shield. With Immortal Ambition, Life Leech is not removed in either case. There are two different definitions of full life at play when it comes to Immortal Ambition. This effect, which enables persistent Leech, refers to full unreserved life, since that's the point at which Life Leech is normally removed. However, this effect, which allows Life Leech to recover Energy Shield, only applies when you're at your actual maximum life. This means that if you're playing a hybrid Life Energy Shield build with Immortal Ambition, you should avoid reserving life. Reserving life prevents true full life from ever being reached, which means you will never be able to recover Energy Shield from Life Leech. On the other hand, if you're only using Immortal Ambition for the persistent Leech and don't care about the extra HP from Energy Shield, it's fine to reserve life. Also, Petrified Blood and Immortal Ambition do not synergize, since you cannot leech to full life with Petrified Blood. Getting some Energy Shield is a good way to increase your HP on a low-life Petrified Blood build, but Immortal Ambition will not allow you to leech to your Energy Shield pool while on low life. If all you want is persistent Leech, either Petrified Blood or Immortal Ambition can give you that on its own. What makes Immortal Ambition especially confusing is how it interacts with various modifiers to Life Leech and Energy Shield Leech. To explain this, I'm going to reuse the scenario from the Vaal Pact section of the video, except that we will add 3000 maximum Energy Shield and Immortal Ambition. When you are not on full life, Leech will function exactly as it did before. Each individual instance still recovers 160 life per second for 10 seconds. The 8 instances still combine for 1280 base total recovery per second from Life Leech, which is raised to 8448 by Leech modifiers. However, I am no longer omitting this step, where total recovery per second from Life Leech turns into total life recovery per second from Leech. This 8448 total life recovery per second from Leech value is what's actually limited by the Leech cap, which in this example is still 5600. Altogether, after recovery rate modifiers are applied, you recover 7784 life per second. This is identical to what happened earlier in the video, which makes sense because Immortal Ambition doesn't change Leech's behavior if you aren't on full life. If you are on full life, you still leech life, but that Life Leech causes you to gain Energy Shield instead of life. Because we're still dealing with Life Leech, each individual instance of Leech is unaffected and continues to attempt to recover 160 life per second for 10 seconds. Your total recovery per second from Life Leech also remains unchanged because you still have instances of Life Leech. However, this is where Immortal Ambition comes into play. Immortal Ambition makes the Life Leech recover Energy Shield instead. This means your 8448 total recovery per second from Life Leech turns into 8,448 total energy shield recovery per second from Leech, and your total life recovery per second from Leech is now 0. With 3,000 maximum energy shield, your maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech is 300. This value caps the 8,448 energy shield per second, resulting in 300 energy shield per second. Notice that neither your life leech cap nor your life recovery rate modifier has any effect here, because this is energy shield recovery. To be clear, these are the modifiers that affect this example. Notice that the ones that specify life leech matter, but the ones that specify life recovery do not. Similarly, modifiers that specify energy shield leech don't matter, but the ones that specify energy shield recovery do. Most importantly, the recovery is capped by the energy shield leech cap, not the life leech cap. This example highlights the massive effect that the recent leech changes had on hybrid Immortal Ambition builds. Prior to 3.14, while on full life, you would recover 5,600 energy shield per second instead of 300, since that's the life leech cap. You wouldn't get the full 7,784 life per second, since life recovery rate modifiers have never applied to energy shield recovery. However, 5,600 is a lot better than 300. The current state of Immortal Ambition for hybrid builds is especially weak when you consider that you're also losing 150 energy shield per second at all times. I had originally complicated things further by writing another scenario that added energy shield leech to the previous one, but I don't want to ramble through an example that's not very practical to begin with. All I'll say about this is that if you have both life leech and energy shield leech, you add together your total recovery per second from life leech and your total recovery per second from energy shield leech. This sum is your total energy shield recovery per second from Leech, which is then subject to the energy shield leech cap. In short, adding energy shield leech doesn't help much because it contributes to the same cap that life leech does. There is one exception where the apparent downside of Immortal Ambition can be bypassed. If you can make your life leech recover instantly, the energy shield leech cap is irrelevant. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Bloodseeker makes all recovery from life leech apply instantly. Notice that I didn't say that life recovery was instant. All recovery, including energy shield recovery, is instant, as long as it comes from instances of life leech. This means that if you use Bloodseeker, have Immortal Ambition, and are on full life, your life leech will recover energy shield instantly. To illustrate the power of this, let's do a quick example. Let's reuse the previous example, except that now you leech instantly thanks to Bloodseeker. Let's also remove all modifiers to recovery per second and recovery rate, because they don't affect instant leech anyway. If you are not on full life, you still create an instance of Leech that recovers 1,600 life. However, instead of that recovery being spread out over 10 seconds, it all occurs immediately. If you hit 8 enemies, this corresponds to 12,800 instant life recovery. You don't have that much maximum life, so only some of these life leech instances will actually recover life. Once one of the leech instances fills your life, the remaining instances will instead recover energy shield. While on full life, each life leech instance gained will recover 1,600 energy shield instantly. In short, Bloodseeker and Immortal Ambition have really good synergy. Because you create instances of life leech, the amount that each instance recovers is capped at 10% of your maximum life instead of 10% of your maximum energy shield. In this example, 10% of maximum life was increased to 20% of maximum life, but the point still stands. Furthermore, because Instant Leech ignores leech rate modifiers, you can bypass the heavy restriction on energy shield recovery that would hamper a typical Immortal Ambition hybrid build. I've mentioned Mahuxotl's Machination a couple of times so far, and I want to highlight one specific interaction it has with Leech. I don't want to get into everything this shield does, or explain every interaction it has with other game mechanics, but the short version is that it grants 6 keystones, including one that is unique to the shield itself, called Everlasting Sacrifice. Although the item grants Vaal Pact, which doubles the life leech cap, it also grants Eternal Youth, which cuts it in half. These two effects negate each other. You do still benefit from the other part of Vaal Pact, which increases your total recovery per second from life leech. This makes it take half as many instances of leech to reach the leech cap. Now for some of the more interesting effects of this shield. Due to Immortal Ambition, you cannot regenerate or recharge energy shield, but you can recover energy shield with life leech or energy shield leech. With Corrupted Soul, you gain some energy shield based on maximum life. However, with Divine Flesh, all damage taken bypasses energy shield, which means that your energy shield does not function as HP at all. Instead, thanks to Everlasting Sacrifice, the energy shield functions as a battery that slowly fills as you leech and slowly drains while you aren't leeching. When your energy shield fills, it immediately empties, but raises all maximum resistances by 5% for 4 seconds. There are other cool things that this shield does, but I want to focus on the parts that relate to Leech specifically. If you watched the previous section on Immortal Ambition, you can probably see why this boost to maximum resistances can be unreliable. Maximum total energy shield recovery per second from Leech has a base value of 10% of maximum energy shield. This means that you can only leech up to 10% of your maximum energy shield per second by default. Since you lose 5% of maximum energy shield per second, it takes 20 seconds at the leech cap to reach maximum energy shield. Without any help, Everlasting Sacrifice will only be granting its bonus to maximum resistances at most 20% of the time, so you definitely want to give it some help. Increasing the energy shield leech cap helps a lot, but it's not easy to do, and Ghost Reaver is generally not a desirable option because it prevents life leech instances from being created in the first place. Aside from increasing the leech cap, there are other ways to boost energy shield recovery. For example, with Supreme Decadence, you can use flasks to recover energy shield. Other noteworthy recovery sources, such as gain on hit and recover on kill modifiers, can work as well. However, the one synergy to which I really want to draw your attention is the synergy with Instant Leech. As I highlighted in the Immortal Ambition section, Instant Leech avoids the most annoying new downside of Immortal Ambition because it is unaffected by maximum total recovery per second modifiers. You can get Instant Energy Shield Leech with Mahuxotl's Machination by pairing it with a Bloodseeker. With Instant Leech, it should be trivial to maintain uptime on the maximum resistances from Everlasting Sacrifice. The downside is that Bloodseeker has mediocre damage, but there are clever ways to build around that. The keystone with arguably the most dramatic effect on Leech's behavior is Strength of Blood, which is found on the Lethal Pride Jewel. Strength of Blood essentially converts life recovery from Leech into damage reduction. In other words, it makes Leech prevent damage instead of recovering from it. Before I continue, I should note that although the following explanation is consistent with how Strength of Blood is implemented in-game, it is not consistent with the current wording of Strength of Blood's description. Both lines specify recovery from life leech when the keystone actually uses life recovery from Leech. This is important because, as I explained earlier, there is no longer a cap on recovery per second from life leech. The cap is now applied to life recovery per second from Leech. Therefore, the current wording might lead you to conclude that Strength of Blood can easily grant damage immunity. This is not the case. To be consistent with the patch 3.14 Leech changes, Strength of Blood was changed to instead use life recovery from Leech, but its wording has not been updated yet. With that out of the way, let's get into the specifics. Strength of Blood provides 1% less damage taken per 2% total life recovery per second from Leech. In exchange, all life recovery from Leech will fail to apply. Strength of Blood does not set your total life recovery per second from Leech to 0. That would make the damage reduction not work. What it does is make it so that whatever your life recovery per second is, you will not actually gain life from Leech. Let's again reuse this scenario from the Vaal Pact discussion. In this scenario, the final value of total life recovery per second from Leech is 70% of maximum life. Thus, Strength of Blood provides 35% less damage taken. However, none of the life recovery from Leech is actually applied, so you need other ways to recover life. Note that it is not the final value of 97.3% that is used to compute the damage reduction. Life recovery rate modifiers apply after all Leech calculations are done, and therefore after Strength of Blood's damage reduction is determined. Basically, with Strength of Blood, Leech still follows all the same rules it normally does regarding leech rate and duration. It's just that you won't ever see the actual recovery from life leech. Instead of recovering life, Leech prevents life loss by lowering damage taken. For best results, you almost certainly want Vaal Pact, which doubles the damage reduction from Strength of Blood. However, Vaal Pact also disables life regeneration, which means that neither Leech nor regeneration is a viable option for recovering life. The trickiest problem to solve when building around Strength of Blood is how to recover life with limited options. Strength of Blood on its own does not prevent Leech from being removed at full life. To make Strength of Blood more reliable, you will want to get some form of persistent Leech, for example by playing a Slayer. However, one form of persistent Leech, Immortal Ambition, has some important anti-synergy with Strength of Blood, which I will get into now. Immortal Ambition prevents life leech from being removed at full life, which on its own is good for Strength of Blood. However, while on full life, your life leech recovers energy shield instead of life. This means that your total life recovery per second from Leech is 0. Since this is the stat from which Strength of Blood scales, Strength of Blood grants no damage reduction while on full life with Immortal Ambition. This is a new conflict between Strength of Blood and Immortal Ambition that did not exist prior to the Leech changes in patch 3.14. Technically, Strength of Blood only prevents life recovery from Leech. This means that Strength of Blood does not prevent life leech from recovering energy shield due to Immortal Ambition. However, this apparent benefit is irrelevant because you lose the damage reduction from Strength of Blood, which is the entire point of using the keystone. If all you want is the energy shield recovery, you can get that with Immortal Ambition alone. There is a workaround that allows you to take advantage of persistent Leech from Immortal Ambition while using Strength of Blood. Immortal Ambition's energy shield recovery only kicks in at maximum life, not maximum unreserved life. If you reserve any amount of your life, you will prevent Immortal Ambition from ever switching life recovery to energy shield recovery. This allows you to maintain the damage reduction from Strength of Blood, since your Life Leech will always attempt to recover life instead of energy shield. Thus, you can benefit both from Immortal Ambition's persistent leech and from Strength of Blood's damage reduction by using, for example, a level 1 Vitality linked to Arrogance support. The downside of this is that you'll never be able to recover energy shield with Leech, but if you're not a hybrid build, this is a small price to pay. Strength of Blood should not be used with Bloodseeker. Strength of Blood prevents all recovery from Life Leech, including instant recovery. Also, Instant Leech has no duration, and therefore will not grant any damage reduction with Strength of Blood. There are ways to leech life without actually hitting anything. By far the most common way this is done is by having damage from your totems, minions, mines, or traps leeched to you as life. The Chieftain's Tukahama War's Herald notable, the Ascendant's Chieftain notable, and the Troll Timber Spire unique shield all make your totem's damage leech life to you. The Baron unique helmet makes damage from minions, specifically zombies, leech life to you. Lastly, the Machina Mitz gloves can make damage from mines leech life to you. There is currently no way to make traps leech life to you. You can also leech without damaging enemies at all. This can be done with a flask suffix that makes you leech from damage dealt to you. You can craft this suffix on flasks after you've unveiled it on a Cinder Swallow urn. To take things one step further, there is a way to leech without damage being dealt to anything. The Devouring Totem skill consumes corpses and leeches a fixed amount of life and mana to the player based on the level of the gem. All of these indirect leech options grant leech whose behavior is determined by the player's stats. If 300 life is leeched to you by any of these options, the 300 life leeched will be treated the same way as 300 life leeched from one of your hits, meaning it will interact in the same way with all of the mechanics mentioned earlier in this video. There are several other interactions that are worth mentioning but don't warrant an extended discussion. Temporal Chains makes other effects expire more slowly on affected targets. This includes leech instances. A level 1 0% quality Temporal Chains, when applied to the player, will make leech instances expire 20% slower, effectively, but not technically, increasing their duration by 25%. This does not change their recovery rate, so each instance will effectively recover 25% more than before. Temporal Chains has no effect on Instant Leech because it has no duration. The Wretch is a unique belt that deals chaos damage to enemies that you leech from. I don't know everything about this item's mechanics, but I think I get most of it. When you hit an enemy and create a life leech instance, the Wretch deals chaos damage to that enemy for the duration of the leech instance. This chaos damage is reflected damage, which means it cannot be leeched from or scaled by damage modifiers. The Wretch's damage is based on the recovery granted by individual life leech instances, which means that increased total recovery per second from life leech does nothing to improve its damage, as that modifier does not affect individual instances. It is recommended to pair the Wretch with Persistent Leech to allow it to work while on full life, even if you're using Bloodseeker to make the damage instant instead of over time. If you're playing an Impale build, the damage dealt by Impale will not grant you Leech. You will still leech from non-Impale damage, but Impale itself deals reflected damage, which cannot be leeched from. That's just about everything I can think to cover regarding leech mechanics. I'm probably forgetting some stuff, so feel free to make corrections or ask clarifying questions in the comments. I do try to respond to all questions and constructive feedback on my videos. I fully expect that within 24 hours somebody will point out some glaring thing I missed and make me regret all my life choices, but please do it anyway. I'm not 100% sure what my next video will be about, but whatever it is, it can't possibly be as complex as Leech is. I'm leaning toward conversion mechanics for the next one, but feel free to request other things. Thanks for watching.